Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Sorry about that little mix-up. I'm Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. Happy Thursday. Hope you guys have enjoyed your day thus far and are just tuning in for another great edition of the show. We're going to do a more general betting preview today, looking at some popular prop bets for Sunday's slate of games. We looked at Thursday Night Football. Enjoy that game tonight. And also, we're going to transition a little bit to the world of college football yet again as we get into a pretty exciting Week 5 with a lot of big contests there. I'm also, in between, going to be talking about my Shadow Report, the wide receiver cornerback matchups that will define fantasy football this weekend, and also conclude my personal positional rankings based off of the matchups with my defenses and special teams units. And lastly, I will conclude my show with a little bit of an injury update and certain fantasy implications surrounding certain injuries around the league. But before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you to consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network as a whole. It is greatly appreciated in whatever capacity you choose to contribute. One way in which you can do that while you are watching the show is through the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features, and also considering leaving tips and donations as well. They're a great way to contribute to the show, interact with the show. One of my favorite parts of the show because I want to get everyone's opinions on the show, not just mine. So if you do feel so inclined and you have anything you want to mention in the chat, feel free to leave it there and I will address it as soon as I possibly can throughout the show. Without further ado, let's jump right into our first segment of the day, talking about some popular prop bets around the NFL for Sunday's slate of games. A lot of interesting storylines here. We're getting into the thick of it, really. A lot of divisional games are going to pop up. And let's start off with a game and a player that should be a very intriguing storyline and bet to follow, because the narrative of this game can shift in so many different ways, but it's still an integral game to kind of start the divisional conversation in the NFC. And it's Vikings-Packers. It's concerning Jordan Love. And I think that this particular prop bet may not even be applicable to this game, and here's why. I like the under for Jordan Love, whether or not he plays, which is the big part of this whole bet, because there still is doubt whether or not he is going to play in this game. He was a limited participant in practices both yesterday and today. He says he feels much better, but it's still up in the air whether or not he does play this game, which is kind of shocking because this was kind of the benchmark to see where he was and whether or not he will be able to play, because this is now a very important divisional game, because if Minnesota wins this game, then they have pretty firm control over the top of the division immediately. So even though, it's still up in the air, if he does play, I do kind of like the under here, because minus 110, you don't know what Jordan Love's going to look like. You don't know what the game script is going to be. And also, Brian Flores' defense has been impressive. We have to give them their flowers in terms of determining how this game will play out, because you can't just look at the Packers offense and say, oh, well, if Jordan Love steps back into it, it will immediately become this offensive juggernaut again. Because remember, in that first game that they played in Brazil, yes, it was a very different environment. They were very big play reliant, and they didn't necessarily have a true rhythm to them. So even if Jordan Love is healthy for this game, even if he has the occasional big play in this game, I feel like the Vikings defense is more than well equipped to kind of limit the control they have of the football. And I think that that's going to hinder what Jordan Love's going to do in this game should he play. But this could come back to bite me, because at the end of the day, we still don't know whether or not he's going to play. I know it's crazy to say, but for now, this prop bet, once you hear news of whether or not he is going to play, should become very popular, because I have more faith right now in what the Vikings defense can do, what the Packers offense can do with potentially a very gimpy Jordan Love in that offense. And let's go over to someone who I've been wanting to mentioned positively from a betting perspective or even a fantasy perspective for so long, but just hasn't lived up to the hype. DeAndre Swift. This week kind of feels like the week where he could get right. However, facing a Rams defense that's really kind of topsy-turvy. I don't know how to define this Rams defense. They apply a good amount of pressure, have one of the higher pressure rates in the league, but it really doesn't amount to much. And this feels like a game where it's going to be dictated on game control. Whether or not either Los Angeles or Chicago is going to control the ball. And I feel like in this game, while they've seen a lot of good things out of Caleb Williams from that last game, they kind of want to protect him a little bit, I feel like. They have to protect him, so to speak. And considering the fact that they still don't have Keenan Allen out there, even though he found a good connection with Rome Odunze, you got to get the run game going somehow if you want to have any chance for Caleb to not have that game be an aberration. So DeAndre Swift kind of forcibly has to hit the over here. And it is an even betting line here at 43.5 rush yards. We're not asking a lot of him, but it's kind of a rhythm kind of thing because this Rams team still can find a way to win this game. They found a way to beat San Fran, albeit a very depleted San Fran team. But now, I got to feel like the Bears have to feel like they can take an advantage here. They seemingly have the advantage on both sides of the ball, potentially, and they have to recognize that in order for that success to carry over to the future, the short-term future that is, then they have to establish the run game. And DeAndre Swift's going to have to be a big part of it, and I believe in him still. I still believe in him as the guy who was one of the better running backs in the league as a Lion, as an Eagle, and now in Chicago, he just has to get going in order for this offense to really be a unit that I rely upon in the future. So DeAndre Swift could be a popular bet. And let's go to Nico Collins, kind of a guy who we expected to be still the wide receiver one in Houston, but for the past couple of weeks, whether because the offense itself hasn't clicked or because C.J. Stroud has had trouble distributing the football to his many receivers, Nico Collins really hasn't gotten going. But in this game, it should be an easy job for him to get open because he's playing one of the worst defenses in the league in Jacksonville. And the thing about Nico Collins is that I feel like it's more dependent on whether or not C.J. Stroud is comfortable in the pocket than it is about Nico Collins getting open. Because this unit will most likely play its best against divisional opponents, but also I feel like that game in Minnesota against that Brian Flores coach defense is not indicative of what I feel like defenses will try and do week in, week out against the Texans. I feel like that game plan was more predicated on stopping what Stroud can do and kind of frustrating him rather than the receivers. Very few people at the end of the day can, disguise pressures like Brian Flores can in terms of, sending pressure on certain downs, disguising it on certain downs. And I don't think the Jacksonville Jaguars are a team that can be good at doing that. So I think Nico Collins will have a very nice day at minus 115. And look for him to get back into the swing of things, Through the first couple of weeks, he has kind of been frustrated. But he's played some pretty good defenses, and I don't expect defenses to keep up with this Texans wide receiver room for much longer. They still are one of the better teams with one of the better wide receiver rooms in the league, and Nico Collins is indicative of that. So that was more of a C.J. Stroud-centric game plan for a defense that they're going to see all year. So Nico Collins, I feel confident in hitting that over. And then Justin Jefferson as well. We were kind of worried about him. Like, will he miss a certain amount of time with that leg contusion? But no, he came back very healthy, looked very awesome in that game against the Texans. Again, not putting up the most spectacular of numbers, but still contributing to that offense. But in this game, I feel like he's going to hit the over, 79.5 yards, minus 110. Kind of feels like a game where he is going to be hungry to show up and show out. And the Vikings will probably, as a result, be hungry to show up and show out. Because here's the thing. Justin Jefferson, for what it's worth, as Andre says, ever since you called Andre Yoshevas getting 40 yards this week, I'm never down another bet. How did you know? Hey, man, I feel like I kind of see what teams look like at certain points of the season, whether it be injury crises or the rhythm of how they're playing, the tempo of how they're playing, and I just go from there. I also try and look at different prop bets from different websites and see how it kind of plays out with my personal predictions of how a guy is playing. But at the end of the day, it's really kind of down to, whether or not I actually believe in these. And when I look at all of the ones I have for this week, they can either hit or they can kind of be a swing and a miss here, because at the end of the day, the DeAndre Swift one is kind of asking a lot from what I've seen of the Bears' rushing attack. But I still believe in it because I think that they're going to have to at some point expand that attack. And the other ones I just feel like are second nature a little bit because they are the stars of their team. And at any given moment against any given team, they feel inevitable almost. So I'm not taking that much credit for coming up with these bets, but they are, at the end of the day, my personal and informed decisions on who I think will shine. But Justin Jefferson, I think will have a nice, good week, because here's the thing. He has been injured for these kind of divisional games against Green Bay, as well as his cornerback we're going to talk about a little bit in the next segment, Jair Alexander. This is kind of the first time that he's really going into this game fully healthy and fully prepared. And this might be a trap game for Minnesota, but I just feel like Justin Jefferson will overcome that. And as Andre is asking about tonight's game as well, do you think tonight's game is going to be a competitive one? I can see the games going so many ways. I absolutely agree with you. I don't necessarily think it's going to be competitive in terms of how the game will play out, because I think that the Dallas Cowboys could dominate, but I don't think it will show up stat-wise, if you get what I'm saying. I think the Dallas Cowboys will have more control over the game, but it's not going to show up in the stat sheet, because I feel like the Giants' defense, for what it's worth, is very opportunistic in what it does, but it's also a defense that can generate pressure from the interior, from the edge, in many different ways. And I think that if Dallas sticks with a game script of just Dak and CD, then that could be very troublesome for them. But there can be some moments where, Dallas wants to wear out this New York defense. So I feel like it can be quote-unquote competitive in terms of the score line, but not necessarily the stat sheet, if you get what I'm saying. But at the end of the day, I agree with you in terms of how the game flow can go either way, because I really don't have much faith. As Andre also says, I think the Giants' D-line is going to get to Dak a lot tonight. I think that's honestly a pretty solid opinion to have of this Giants D-line, because I think Dak is starting to become a little too overconfident in McCarthy's game plans week in, week out. So I'm not certain that it's going to work in a divisional game that certainly feels like it should be a dominant Cowboys win. But the Giants certainly have a little bit of momentum coming into it, so it could go either way. If Dak can't stay on schedule and the offense collapses around him, then this could be a bloodbath going the Giants' way, if you want my opinion. But it is going to be a very weird game to follow. But thank you for your comments. Hope you guys enjoyed Thursday Night Football. We do have to take a quick break. I'm sorry I didn't get to the last bet that I wanted to get to, but we do have to take a quick break. And coming up next, I go over my weekly shadow report and the wide receiver cornerback matchups that I think will define fantasy football this week. We'll be right back to talk about that right after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?